Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I am Melinda Ayer, and I am going to be your moderator and fearless host tonight for this CEBV Spotlight conversation on education. And I am super excited to have with me here tonight. We have three career educators. We have Arizona's current Superintendent of Public Instruction, Kathy Hoffman. She's the first educator to lead the Arizona Department of Education in over 20 years. Before becoming our superintendent, she worked in Arizona's public schools as a preschool teacher and then a speech pathologist. Arizona voters elected her in 2018, and she's currently running for her second term. We also have State Representative Judy Schwiebert, who taught for 27 years in Arizona as an English teacher and a librarian. She was elected in 2021 to her first term in the Arizona House of Representatives, and she's now running for re-election in the newly drawn Legislative District 2. And we have Laura Terech, who's a former elementary school teacher in Phoenix, who became a community organizer after part of her ceiling collapsed over a rug full of kindergartners while teaching. She's now running as a first-time candidate for the Arizona House of Representatives in the newly drawn Legislative District 4. So welcome to the three of you. It is my honor and privilege to have you here tonight. And we do have, a bit of a time constraint. We have 1 hour exactly. So I'm going to jump right in and give the first question for Superintendent Hoffman. And I wanted to ask you about Arizona education metrics, such as teacher salary, per student spending, class size, and counselor to student ratio. I know that Arizona has had some issues in these areas, and I would like for you to tell us more.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you all. So it's no secret that Arizona has had challenges. Our schools have been severely funded for years now. During the Great Recession, back around 2008 to 2010, Arizona cut more from public education than any other state in the country, and we're still recovering from those cuts. As of now, to date, we still have among the lowest teacher pay on average in the country, along with lowest per pupil spending. And of course, these have devastating impacts on our schools and our ability to recruit and retain high quality teachers. I know even just in comparing our state to the neighboring states in the Southwest region, teachers can easily make $10,000 more just by crossing across into a different state like New Mexico or Utah, any of our surrounding states. I was actually just a couple of days ago in San Luis, and they said they often lose their veteran, most experienced teachers to California, where they can make double the salary. So this continues to be a significant issue. In the area of counselors, school counselors who provide social emotional support along with college and career readiness skills, Arizona continues to rank at the bottom for the student to school counselor ratio. However, we are moving in the right direction. When I started in 2019, our student to school counselor ratio was about 905 students for every one school counselor. And through state and federal investments, we've been able to decrease that ratio by 20%. So now we're at roughly 716 students for every one school counselor, which is phenomenal to make such a big difference over the past couple of years. But again, still ranked last in the country. So we're still making progress. Really grateful that the legislature actually just passed an additional $50 million towards our school safety grant program, which will continue to add school counselor and social worker positions along with other school safety positions to our schools.
All right, it does sound like we've made some fantastic progress. I know that we've seen an influx of federal dollars in the last couple of years. How has that changed the game here in Arizona?
The federal funds have made a world of difference. So first we had the CARES Act, and then most recently the American Rescue Plan, which was a huge investment into our public education system. Altogether, Arizona has been in the process of, we've been allocating just over $4 billion of these federal COVID relief funds. And these are more flexible types of funding. So a lot of, as I traveled the state, I've continued to, as you heard, I was just in San Luis, I was up in Snowflake recently, Prescott, Tucson, visiting schools. And so I could see firsthand exactly where those dollars were going. A lot of our schools have put the funds towards hiring new mental health professionals for their schools, for math and reading specialists. Sometimes they use it towards their facilities to create like new outdoor learning spaces, or even for the arts, like in a Tucson school, an elementary school, they had a new computer lab where the students have software where they can learn graphic design. They had a new dance studio. So again, we want to make sure our schools are engaging, where we want to make sure when families and students come into our schools, they feel safe and welcome and engaged. So it's really exciting to see when our schools have the funding and resources available to them, what is possible. And we are seeing academic growth over the past year, looking at that data. So we know we are moving in the right direction, even though we, of course, still have a lot of work to do together.
That's very encouraging to hear. Thank you for sharing. Representative Schwiebert, I wanted to ask you about the teacher retention crisis. I know as a parent, I have seen quite the revolving door in my children's classrooms, and I understand that over a third of classrooms in Arizona no longer have a permanent certified teacher. So please tell us more about that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here, Melinda. I'm really honored to be here, especially with Kathy Hoffman and with Laura Terech. So yes, about a third of our students no longer have a permanent qualified teacher in their classroom, which is not only a disaster for them, but also a disaster for their families, and even a disaster for all of us who want to live in a safe community that's thriving economically. People need to have a way to support themselves, to have a sense of purpose, to have the skills they need to make a living, and we need to have qualified workers in order to live in a thriving community. So each year, the Arizona School Personnel Report is released. It has not been released for this year, but in February of 2022, they released their statistics that over 6,300 positions still needed to be filled for that school year. And that included 2,000 vacant teacher positions. In addition to that, 48% of teacher positions were filled by people who did not meet standard teacher requirements. 31% of teacher positions remained vacant, and 48% of teacher positions were filled by people, again, who did not meet those standard teacher requirements. We have so many wonderful teachers in our classrooms, and yet they're burning out quickly. Some of them are sticking around for a whole career, but too many of them just get depressed and leave the profession early. As a matter of fact, the Morrison Institute just a few years ago said that 42% of Arizona teachers who were hired in 2013 left the profession within 3 years. And that is not counting, of course, some of the things that have happened since then. COVID-19 and the requirements of that led some teachers to leave the classroom. And unfortunately, we have had a majority in the legislature that has been more focused on attacks on our teachers than on actually making teachers' lives better and helping to attract and retain teachers. some of those attacks have included things like book banning, like requiring teachers to list every single material that they might ever use in their classroom before teaching anything, threatening teachers with the loss of their teaching certificate if a parent wasn't satisfied with with how well the administration was handling their complaint about a teacher. And instead, as Superintendent Hoffman was saying, we so need to invest in our teachers. We need to bring teacher salaries up to the national median. We're at least $12,000 a year below the national median. We need to reduce class sizes. We have among the largest class sizes in the nation, as she mentioned. We need to make sure that we are investing in the facilities that need to be maintained. You know, Laura Terech's story about the ceiling collapsing over her kindergarten students. And we can say a lot more about all of that, but those are some of the things that we really need to do if we're going to be serious about keeping teachers in our classrooms.
Yes, absolutely. Superintendent Hoffman, maybe you can tell us some of the teacher recruitment and retention strategies that your office has implemented over the past few years.
Thank you. I love sharing about what is working, because it's important to us that we're also thinking about how are we inspiring the next generation of teachers and educators. And so while I, in my office, don't have the authority over teacher salary, and we continue to advocate at the legislature to make improvements to our teacher salary, there are other strategies that the Department of Education has been implementing. When I first took office, I established the educator recruitment and retention team that works directly with districts, supporting them in their recruitment and retention efforts. We've also, using the federal COVID relief funds at the state level, we've been strategically leveraging those funds. And one of those initiatives was in the first ever teacher residency program, which is in partnership with NAU and the Arizona K-12 Center. So this is creating a new pipeline of teachers. And when they finish the teacher residency program, they will have their master's in education from teacher, and they will already be working alongside a master experienced teacher in one of our local public schools. And there are plans to scale that up and expand the teacher residency program in other parts of the state as well.
It sounds like you are doing as much as you can from where you sit. Laura, would you tell us, conversely, what has the legislature been doing about trying to address the teacher retention crisis?
Yeah, they recently passed, Governor Ducey recently signed there's really no other way to say this besides a warm body law, which it removes the bachelor requirement from educators to be able to go into the classroom. So we're setting up a scenario where truly anyone can teach. And as Judy mentioned, as Rep. Schwiebert mentioned, roughly 1 in 3 classrooms in Arizona lack a permanent, highly qualified teacher, but there's more to the story even than this. There are 60,000 certified teachers in Arizona who will not teach. So when Superintendent Hoffman discusses teacher retention, that's a huge part of this, and making sure that the legislature is investing in these pathways to get highly qualified teachers into the classroom. For myself, I mean, my bachelor's degree is not in education. It's in art history, actually. But I was able to do this very unique program at Arizona State University it was kind of an accelerated program designed for working folks. So I went at night, after I'd worked for the day, and I got not only my master's, I earned not only my master's in curriculum and instruction, but I became a certified teacher through that process. And that included supervised internships and a lengthy period of student teaching. So again, there are real steps that we can take to address this, but this is certainly not the way by just, anyone with a pulse stand up in front of our kids and teach. There are certainly long-term consequences for that as well. That we want to make sure we avoid, give folks the training they need to be successful in the classroom.
Yeah, I had one of my kids' teachers tell me that they could make more waiting tables than working in the classroom. And Representative Schwiebert, you mentioned the Arizona School Personnel Administrators Association, and I remember reading a quote from their director that After 20 by 2020, Arizona went from 49th to 49th in teacher pay, which I think illustrates the size of the hole that we need to dig ourselves out of. But there are also inequities in our school funding system, which disproportionately impact minority students, students living in poverty, and students in rural areas. So Representative Schwiebert, tell us more about that and how we can address these disparities.
Of course. So first of all, education funding I find to be fairly complicated, but it doesn't have to be that way, I don't think, but it is. And one of the complications of it results in much lower funding for rural schools as well as schools in low income areas. So basically some of the funding that schools receive really comes from property taxes, and those property taxes, if you live in an area like Maryvale or downtown Phoenix and in pockets in the Roosevelt district or other areas, there just aren't the property values there that help contribute to the funding of the schools. And the same goes for rural areas that don't have high property values, and particularly our Native American reservations. So as a result of that, there has been a state equalization tax rate that also took money from a small pool of property tax to help equalize the funding and help bring that funding in poorer areas up a little bit. It still doesn't really solve the problem, but it helps. Unfortunately, this past year, the legislature removed that CETR funding, the state equalization tax rate, from a property tax pocket to the general fund of the legislature, which is a much less reliable place to draw those funds from. It's subject to the whims of the majority of the legislature, as opposed to being a formula that actually goes automatically right to those poorer districts. Even so, the poorer districts still are at a disadvantage because our public schools have been so underfunded, especially since 2008, as I think Superintendent Hoffman mentioned earlier, that so many of the districts with better property values are able to pass bond and override elections that help them maintain their facilities and build new buildings and all of that. But too many students in poor districts are left with outdated resources and crumbling buildings. So we need to fix that. One way that a lot of people have talked about fixing it is to create a poverty weight, sometimes called the inverse, an opportunity weight for students living in poverty. We have added into the formula as of this year an opportunity weight of $50 million in the first year that will go up to $100 million, I believe, in 3 years. However, there's always a however. Have you noticed that? Even that is the bare minimum of what is needed for students who need additional resources and support more than anyone. So that's just the ground floor. So we need to do so much better for our students who are living in poverty, but instead the current majority continues to reward schools that have wealth, that have the funding, and provide them with extra funding, when really it's the schools that are serving our poorest children that really need more of that additional funding.
Yes, I've seen some statistics that some students in poverty can require as much as 3 times as much funding in order to lift them up and help them succeed. I know that especially in these COVID times, internet has been a hurdle for many students, particularly broadband in rural areas. And Superintendent Hoffman, I understand that we have made some inroads in that area over the past few years? Can you tell us more?
Yeah, so for me and for many of us, it was very eye-opening during the pandemic to realize the true severity of the digital divide in Arizona, and seeing how many students, families, teachers didn't have access to internet at home or even the technology they needed. So one program I'm also really proud of, one initiative, is called the Final Mile Project. This is so innovative that now it's being duplicated in other states across the country, but we started it right here in Arizona, that with the Final Mile Project. It sounds very simple, but all we're doing is extending high-speed internet from school buildings to students' homes. And so the first district that had project completion was the Paloma Elementary School District. It's a very rural community in Gila Bend, Arizona. And they finished the project. So now 100% of students in the Paloma Elementary School District have high-speed internet at home.
That is fantastic. I know that I had read some stories in the early days of the pandemic about, kids, parking themselves outside the library. Even if the library was closed, they knew that the internet was still on. And that it's just, in these modern days, I sound like my mother, but in these modern days, it's so difficult to learn without access to the internet. So it's very good to hear that we're making that progress. So I have another question for you about taxpayer accountability. I get this question often. Taxpayers, of course, wanting to know that their money is well spent. So would you tell us a little bit about the differences between the accountability measures that are in place for our schools? Just sort of a very broad overview of what measures are in place and how they differ based on what school's receiving the oversight.
Yes, and like many of these topics, this could be an hour-long presentation on this question alone, but just to be brief about it. So in Arizona, we have district schools, we have charter schools, and we have private schools. And our districts and charters are funded 100% by our public funds, and so they are held to the standards of following our accountability system in the sense that all of their students are required to take the state assessments, which is now called the AASA, formerly Easy Merit, along with our high school students now take the ACT. We have other statewide assessments. I won't go into all of the state assessments, but then all of the data, graduation data, all of the demographic data, all of that is on our Arizona Department of Education school report card website, and the State Board of Education has formulas where they determine the letter grades of each school and district on the A through F scale. And so there are those types of academic achievement type of accountability for our district and charter schools that they are held to. They're also required that, district schools and charter schools also have requirements around certification that don't apply to private schools. And this is one of the areas that really concerns me, because if a teacher has any kind of misconduct on their record, then that also is reported through the State Board of Education, whereas in our private school sector, they are not held to that type of standard when there's teacher misconduct. And then one of the other big differences is the charter board, the Arizona State Charter Board, is responsible for overseeing our charter schools. And over the past several years, as a board member, I've also been working with them on establishing a different kind of accountability measures for our charter schools. So they are held to, they have 3 different frameworks. There's an academic framework, a financial framework, and an operations framework. And by using those frameworks, one of the roles of the charter board is to hold charter schools accountable, and actually, when necessary, close charter schools. And so I think sometimes people don't hear about those stories. There's not a lot of people tuning into the charter board meetings, but when we do have a charter school that is not serving its students well, that we can look at the academics, we can look at the operations and finances, and when we see a lot of red flags across all those areas, then the charter board has the authority to close charter schools, whereas we don't see the same for private or district schools. I know we're going to talk about ESAs later, but To me, one just have to finish by saying just the biggest concerns about private school education is we know that not all our private schools are prep schools like Xavier or those types of prep schools. And to me, it's like our public funds should not be going into private institutions where people can profit off of education dollars, where we have literally no idea if private schools are teaching kids how to read, because there's no accountability for their academic achievement or in any of the ways that is required of our district and charter schools. So to me, the private schools are like the black hole for money, and that's where to me there's the least amount of accountability.
And as you mentioned, that brings us directly to the issue of empowerment scholarship accounts, or ESAs, known popularly as school vouchers. So we are seeing, we have just seen an effort by the legislature to expand those to every child, and of course the corresponding referendum effort to put that on the ballot as in 2018 so that voters can choose. And your office has been releasing ESA numbers about who is applying for the universal expansion. Would you tell us just a little bit about that?
All right, just looked to see the most up-to-date information is that to date we have had just over 9,710 applicants, and over 75% of those, let me see, actually approximately 77, I had to make sure I get the most recent update. Now it's up to 77% of those applicants are not coming from public schools. So these are students who are already enrolled in private schools, or they could be homeschooled. But for families and students that are not in our public education system, not in districts, not in charters, we now are seeing that 77% of those 9,710 applications.
All right, so that's quite a high percentage. Laura, Terech, would you tell us some of the problems that you see with voucher expansion?
Well, the accountability factor is huge here. And we've seen in recent weeks, especially, some of the projects that this money goes towards. And I think there was one incredibly egregious example. There was a facility out in Peoria called Uptown Jungle, and it's like a play trampoline center. And they posted on their social media, hey, we're now accepting ESA voucher money. So it goes towards things like that. We saw a home gym, vacations to Australia, ski trips that get lumped into this. And that's just simply not a responsible way to use taxpayer dollars. So there is no accountability and oversight for these programs. We also don't see curriculum or test scores. So the problems with ESA vouchers, especially when you consider, and if you watched some of the testimony surrounding this bill, one of the teachers shared that she has trouble getting purchase orders approved for colored pencils. So that won't go through. And yet, a home gym, an indoor tower garden, we do see those things paid for, again, with taxpayer dollars. So there are a lot of problems to be had with ESA vouchers, especially at this universal level that we see now.
And to be clear, you can purchase those things under the existing program if you have a curriculum that calls for them. So it's the way that lawmakers wrote the program. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah, if you can demonstrate. And then we also saw that some of these were rejected initially, and then they kept coming back, and then they'd be approved on a second or third pass, with some tweaks in there. So there are certainly ways to get these things paid for. I suppose if there's a will, there's a way.
All right. Superintendent Hoffman, I know that you have been very vocal about this sort of arcane cap called the aggregate expenditure limit, which got a lot of news coverage at the beginning of this year, and now is an issue again. So please tell us more.
Thank you. We're going from ESAs to AEL, but for all of our audience members, if you walk away from today's conversation with anything, please know that the ESAs and the AEL are the two biggest school finance issues facing public education right now. Like this is what you need to walk away with, is the vouchers are a huge threat to our public education system, along with the AEL, the aggregate expenditure limit. Essentially, it's a spending cap that was set back in 1980, only applying to our district schools, because back in 1980, this was before the time of charters. And this past year, we hit the spending cap, and we were well aware that our district schools were going to hit the spending cap. And unfortunately, the Republicans made this into a political issue, a political weapon. They waited until the very last minute to suspend the spending cap, even though so they suspended it for last school year, but now we're coming up to it again, where if the legislature does not take any action, and they do need a 2/3 vote, if they do not take any action by March 1st, we will see over $1.3 billion cut from only district schools, having the most detrimental impact on smaller, especially more rural schools. The smaller the districts are, the bigger the hit is. And this would ultimately lead to shortened school years, staff layoffs, just altogether, our schools cannot operate after cutting that much of their budget in the middle of a school year. And so we have been putting a lot of pressure. Even today, we had a press conference. I was there with Representative Schwiebert and many others, saying that we must have a special session before November, because we are going to have a new governor and new legislative leadership come January. And this is just not something we should be playing around with. When I was in my visiting schools over the past couple of weeks, the superintendents and school leaders are asking me about this, because they want to put more of the new state funds towards things like teacher pay and teacher raises, but they have too much concern about the AEL and not being able to sustain that payment, those raises for their teachers. Yes, there were promises made during the budget that this would be dealt with by the end of the year, and that there would be a special session. And now they are walking back and failing Arizona on those promises. So we do need to keep up the volume, keep up the pressure. There were over 190 district superintendents who recently wrote a letter to the legislature and the governor as well. So school leaders are really calling for action. I'm calling for action. The Democrats are calling for action. So we ask for your support, because it's a wonky issue, but again, it's one of the biggest issues facing our school system right now.
So Representative Schwiebert, if I'm understanding this correctly, the lawmakers down at the legislature have effectively given schools money, and then they're not allowing them to spend it. Is that about right?
That's exactly right. I was just going to mention that. Thank you. So Arizona had over a $5 billion revenue surplus this last year, and many of us were very pleased to be able to pass a budget that included an additional $1 billion out of the budget for our public schools. So, and that's without raising a penny in taxes on anyone. So we've provided that additional funding, but without lifting the aggregate expenditure limit, the school districts, they actually have that money in their accounts, but by law, they're not allowed to actually spend it. So that's why it's so urgent that we act now to hold a special session, and as the governor had promised during budget negotiations, to lift that cap and allow school districts to spend the money that the majority of the legislators voted to provide.
So if I'm not mistaken, the cap would be, as of March 1st, schools would have to cut a total of about 17% of their yearly budget. Is that about right?
That's my understanding as well, yes.
And there's no certainty until the legislature acts.
Correct.
Okay.
It's a simple thing for us to do at this point. and we need to actually address it on a permanent basis. Last year, we addressed it on a one-year basis. Democrats wanted to make it a permanent basis, but instead we're faced with this Groundhog Day scenario, where once again, we're in that same situation unless we create a permanent fix.
I know that there have been some lawmakers like Senator Livingston who have tried to connect voucher expansion and the public's distaste for that and the referendum that's currently going on with the AEL issue. And I'm wondering if you've heard anything further about that.
No, I've heard pretty much the same thing. My response when I heard on social media that Senator Livingston threatened that if we were to pursue this referral to the ballot of the voucher expansion, that this would be war on our public schools. Well, what he's doing is he's declaring war on our children. And in fact, I think they've already declared war on our children with the refusal to provide the resources that our children need. We're still at the bottom of the nation in the national basement when it comes to per pupil investment.
So we have seen a rash of punitive legislation. We've seen, and I'm not sure which of you it was that mentioned. I think Judy, it was you. The book ban bills and the teacher attack bills, the school closure bills, and I would like to know. I would like to know a little bit more about. I'm not sure how to phrase this, but it doesn't seem like what I'm hearing regular people, parents, families talking about. These are not the issues that our schools are facing.
That's exactly right. And that's what I hear from people when I'm talking to constituents. And I try to talk to constituents as often as possible, and certainly quite a bit during campaign season. And what I'm hearing from them is they want investments in our public schools. They're sick and tired of Arizona being in the national basement. And I try to reinforce that I think that our public schools and our teachers are doing a heroic job with the resources that the state legislature provides. I mean, we have national merit finalists. We have young people going to Ivy League schools on scholarships. We have some wonderful career and technical education programs, but we're not reaching all the students that we need to reach. And we're losing teachers like crazy. And we know that the most important component in a classroom for a student to learn effectively is that teacher. So we need some serious investment in our public schools. It's the only way that every child is going to get their chance to thrive. Because I think 90% of students, maybe somebody can check me on that number, 90% of families choose our public schools for their children. And yet those are the ones that it seems like the majority in the legislature are deliberately trying to underfund and drive people out by a number of different means.
I've actually heard numbers as high as 95% when you combine, public district and charter schools. And I've also heard that private school enrollment in Arizona has remained roughly at 5 or 6%, largely flat over the past 30, 40 years. So,
and I'll just say one more thing. And a big way that the majority sold this ESA voucher expansion was that they wanted parents to be able to take their children out of failing public schools and give poor children the opportunity to go to a private school by giving them a voucher. When the reality is the children who are living in poverty, their parents don't have have the time or the resources to transport them to a private school. They don't have the resources to pay the additional tuition that they would need to pay in addition to that voucher money. And they don't have the resources to pay for other supplies that would be required at the private schools. So as we see from Superintendent Hoffman's remarks, it is the families who can already afford to send their children to private schools who are taking advantage of these vouchers. So basically, everyday taxpayers are subsidizing those who can already afford to send their students to a private school and leaving our public school students without the resources that they deserve.
That's disturbing indeed, especially since Arizona taxpayer funding is not unlimited. So Laura, I would love for you to just tell us a little bit about Arizona's revenues and the impact on public education. I know that that tax cuts and credits figure in prominently into this picture. So what can you tell us?
Yeah, for this, I highlight the flat tax that was passed last year. And I feel like even calling it a flat tax is not quite doing it justice. This is really a tax cut. This was the biggest tax cut in the last 3 decades. And it's making Arizona's tax system even more regressive than it already was. And when we say regressive tax system, what we mean is that the heaviest burden is placed on middle and low income earners. So they pay a greater percentage of their income than that upper bracket. So we have scenarios where teachers are paying a greater percentage of their income than CEOs. This is only going to further that divide because it's going to make a flat tax pushing more of the general fund into our sales tax. So we have, our income tax and then sales tax as well. This is going to push more into the sales tax to fund the programs that we need. But that becomes regressive in and of itself the more we do this, because if folks are facing elevated sales tax, if you're a lower middle income earner, again, that's a greater percentage of your income. This tax cut gives high income earners roughly $350,000 a year when all is said and done, and those lowest income earners are going to benefit by about $4. And the impact that this has on Arizona's budget is huge. We stand to lose estimates are around $2 billion. And that's funding things like education, our roads, infrastructure. This also has a huge impact on cities and towns because they get a lot of their revenue from this as well. So, what's really frustrating about this is we've seen this tried before. This was done in Kansas. They did a flat tax in 2012. And the theory was that it would offer, this unprecedented economic boom and bring all of these jobs and things like that. We saw exactly the opposite. They had to make huge cuts to their education system. They did not see the job growth that they anticipated. They had to raise their sales tax and again, push that burden onto everyday Kansonians. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. And we're set up to see the same thing here. Education activists and advocates and other folks tried to refer this to the ballot to let the voters decide. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court struck that down. And what was really surprising and shocking about that is the reason that it was struck down is they said that taxpayers, ballot initiatives can't go before the voters because it has to do with the support and maintenance of the state budget. Well, this tax cut is not a support and maintenance of the budget, but unfortunately that was struck. It's very difficult to undo something like this because it would take a supermajority in the state legislature. So again, this will require some creative problem solving moving forward with a new legislature who wants to prioritize lower and middle income earners because they see the benefit that has for our public schools, which we know education is the economic engine that drives our entire state. So there's a long way to go with that. And yeah, there's a lot of work to do. As always, the end of any answer to these questions is there's a long way to go. We just need the right people in place to do it.
Yes, and I apologize for my dogs. It's apparently bark o'clock here at my home. One thing that I want to say about revenues is that we may be okay now because we're in boom times and revenues are growing, but we know that is not again, that is not infinite, and eventually we will see another recession because that's just the way things work. It's an up and down cycle, and once we hit that recession and find ourselves in a hole that we can't dig our way out of, I worry very much for the state of not just our public schools, but our state, the state of our entire state. So that's an issue, and like you said, we have a long way to go. Representative Schwiebert, I know that there is a capital funding lawsuit ongoing, and the latest that I have heard is that perhaps that would go to trial as soon as this month, but more likely in January. But if you could give us just a very quick sort of outline of what's happening there.
Of course. Thank you for that question. So Arizona has cut more from public education than any other state since 2009. And they have not fulfilled their promises, our promises to our schools for the funding that they were supposed to be receiving. So the Arizona Superintendents Association, the Arizona School Board Association, the Arizona Education Association, plus several school districts, as well as a private citizen, have filed a $4.56 billion lawsuit against the state of Arizona for failing to fund our public schools. That number was derived from not only the capital funding formula that goes to building and maintaining school facilities and resources, but also something called district additional assistance, which is part of the education formula. That the district additional assistance amount should be attached to inflation. It should be indexed to inflation. The charter additional assistance amount is indexed to inflation, but not public district schools. So that doesn't even account, that $4.56 billion doesn't even account for inflation. So as far as I know, I had not heard that it could go to trial as soon as this month. I had heard that it would go to trial in January. So it's really a sad state of affairs, isn't it? When our school districts, the very organizations that are charged with educating our children, have to sue our state to get the funds that they've been promised that we should be providing, because it's not only a constitutional mandate to educate our children, but it's a moral mandate, and it's a mandate that's really in our best interest, as I spoke about earlier. So we are going to have to see what happens with that lawsuit. It's wait and see.
Yeah, and the news that I had seen that the trial was slated for this month was very recent news, but one of the folks that was quoted in that article was the superintendent out in Gila Bend, who made a comment that has been sitting with me ever since I read that article, which is that our schools should have nicer facilities than our prisons. And that just breaks my heart.
Absolutely. Doesn't it make so much sense to invest in our public schools that help students develop the skills and the purpose to go out into the world and contribute to society? But instead, for too long, our Arizona legislature has instead prioritized just locking people up once they're lost. It makes so much more sense to invest at the outset of people's lives, as opposed to the huge expense that Arizona makes in funding our prisons. If I'm not mistaken, I think Arizona spends more on our private prisons than any other state.
No, I believe it's more than on higher education.
Oh, it's definitely more. We spend more on prisons, on incarcerating people, than we do on all three universities combined.
So that just leads me right into policy solutions. And there are so many things that we could be doing. And I know that each of you has robust plans for how you would like to lead us into the future. So Superintendent Hoffman, I'd like to hear yours first.
Sure. Well, as a new mom, I'll start with a topic that we haven't touched on as much yet, which is early childhood education. So Arizona does not currently provide any funding, any state funding for preschool programs, and we still do not fully fund full day kindergarten. So we know there's parents out there who are paying tuition if they want an extended school day, but this, I think this is truly holding our state back to not have more preschool and more full day kindergarten opportunities across the state. Another quick story from my trip to San Luis the other day when I visited the Gadsden Elementary School District. They were so proud to show me their preschool classrooms, and I'm a former preschool teacher, and they have 8 classrooms full of, and they're with the class size of 18 students in their preschools, but they have a wait list of 100 kids. And I was asking them about, like, you know, how can we help you expand your preschool program? And they said, well, actually, we have enough funding to hire more staff, to be able to purchase more supplies and resources to have more preschool programs. We simply don't have the building space. And they're not allowed to, this is true, they're not allowed to use other like grant funds or their special education funding to build buildings. There's restrictions on that. So it again goes back to that, maybe back to that capital lawsuit of how are we ensuring that we're being able to invest in the buildings and the capital. But yeah, so one thing we need to continue to be advocating for is the ability for our schools to expand programs for our youngest, littlest learners.
Okay, Laura, why don't you share yours?
I'd really like to piggyback on what Superintendent Hoffman shared about early childhood education. It's so important. So when I was in the classroom, I taught in a Title I school district, and I would have kiddos come in that they had never been in school before. They'd never had an opportunity for preschool. And you could see the difference very starkly between kids who'd had that opportunity and kids who hadn't. So they'd come and they didn't know necessarily how to hold a pencil or use scissors. And so you're teaching all of those skills in addition to the very rigorous standards that we have in kindergarten. I remember when the state cut full day kinder, there was a lawmaker who said, oh, it doesn't matter because kindergarten is just babysitting anyway. That is not the case. We're teaching reading, writing, math. I mean, they're readers by the time they leave kindergarten, and we need all that time, especially for our low income students or students who are learning English for the first time. My first year in the classroom, I believe we had 5 different languages. So it's really, really important that we set those students up for success for their later educational years. So it's a great passion of mine to restore funding for full day kindergarten. I'd also like to give Superintendent Hoffman the tools that she needs to further the great work that she's doing, particularly with the student to counselor ratio. It's so important in light of COVID, and that dovetails into other areas as well, such as gun violence prevention, that if we're supporting our kiddos with what they need, that we'll see that echo out into other areas. So there's a lot we can do, and I look forward to doing that work.
Yep. I remember I went to Chandler High. You know, I grew up in Arizona, and I remember we had several counselors at Chandler High. And, you know, I would like to see Arizona get back to those days. Representative Schwiebert, I know that you have a very robust plan. So why don't you give us some of the highlights of your plan?
Of course. Thank you so much. So I am one of a number of teachers who are currently serving in the legislature, Senator Christine Marsh and Representative Jennifer Pollack, and Representative Mitzi Epstein is a longtime board member for our schools. And so we got together and we said, okay, here is our plan to invest in Arizona's children. And it includes all the things that Superintendent Hoffman and that Laura just were talking about, plus the AEL. I just put a link into the chat because we're inviting people to go to this website where you can actually sign on to your support for this plan. The very first step, of course, is to focus on lifting Arizona's arbitrary and outdated aggregate expenditure limit. We spoke a lot about that at the beginning of this call. The second thing is to really address this teacher shortage crisis. And that means that we need to increase teacher, but also staff pay to the national median. I spoke to someone the other day who's been working for 22 years as a special aide in a local public school, and she's making $14 an hour. She could make more working at McDonald's. And those staff people are vital to helping to make sure that we're educating our students. We need to reduce class sizes. They're the largest in the country, and we need to fulfill the promised funding for capital expenses so that teachers are teaching in safe environments and their students are learning in safe environments. We want to give every student a strong foundation for success by investing in universal pre-K as well as full-day kindergarten. And we want to address the increasing need to support students' mental health. Again, something that both Superintendent Hoffman and my colleague Laura Terech both mentioned. So I'm proposing creating a school mental health professionals academy, something like the Teachers Academy, to increase that pipeline, and also make permanent the wonderful improvements that Superintendent Hoffman already made using federal dollars that will run out. The Arizona legislature, the state of Arizona, needs to put our own skin in the game and make sure that we are investing in having additional counselors. And then finally, we are committed to protecting our taxpayer investments in our public schools that the vast majority of parents choose by stopping universal voucher expansion that drains almost $1 billion, many say, will drain almost $1 billion out of our public school system. So please sign on to that using that link. We want to make a large statement that these are the things that we are backing and want to invest in for our future.
Well, it couldn't be clearer to me listening to the three of you that if we want public education in Arizona done right, we need to listen to the educators. So I thank the three of you for being here to share your visions for Arizona. I have just dropped your websites into the chat, and I think that it's pretty clear the choice that Arizona voters have, and I wish all three of you the best. So,
can I just add one quick thing? I'm so sorry I forgot to mention this. So this is not only a plan from the current legislators, but for those Democratic legislators like Laura Terech and Jeannie Castine and Cindy Hans and others around the state. They have also signed on to this to make this commitment so that when they are elected, they will help us make sure that we are investing in our children.
That is a great point. So every race on our ballot is going to be so critical this year. And I thank the three of you for joining us tonight. I want to respect your time, and I see we're right up against 7:30. So thank you all so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.